I never thought I'd come home to nothing, to find my house gone, reduced to rubble, and the land I owned for decades stolen by the very HOA that was supposed to protect this neighborhood. But Karen Hamilton, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, thought she could erase me, rewrite the rules, and get away with it. What she didn't know, I'm a judge. Before we dive into this intense story, we have a small favor to ask. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how far our stories reach. Thank you so much. Now let's dive in. I had lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years without issue. It was peaceful, quiet, exactly what I wanted after a long day in court. But then Karen Hamilton arrived. The first time I met her, I didn't think much of it. She was polite, too polite, the kind of person whose smile never reached their eyes. She had moved into one of the newer McMansions at the end of the block, the kind that looked more suited for a suburban nightmare than a historic neighborhood like ours. And within a month of moving in, she had taken over the HOA. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't democratic. She simply decided she was in charge, and before anyone could object, the old HOA president, a nice retired school teacher named Mr. Donovan, had stepped down for personal reasons. I should have paid more attention. But at the time, I was too busy with work. Being a judge meant my days were filled with legal battles, hearings, and appeals. I spent more time in a courtroom than I did at home, so HOA meetings weren't exactly high on my priority list. And that was my first mistake, because while I was busy with my cases, Karen was busy turning the HOA into her own personal empire. At first it was small things. A letter in the mail. Your mailbox does not comply with updated HOA regulations. Please replace it with an approved model within 30 days or face a $200 fine. I ignored it. Then came another. Your front yard landscaping does not align with the community aesthetic. Please remove all non-standard plants or face a $500 fine. This time I sent a polite but firm response. Karen, my property has been maintained the same way for decades. There is no clause in the HOA regulations that requires uniform landscaping. Please refrain from sending further baseless fines. She didn't respond. Instead, I received another violation. Your outdoor lighting is disruptive and does not conform to HOA-approved standards. Please replace all fixtures immediately. That one made me pause, because I didn't even have outdoor lighting beyond my porch lamp. That's when I realized she wasn't just enforcing rules, she was inventing them. I still didn't take it too seriously. After all, I had bigger things to deal with. I was presiding over a high-profile criminal case that had been dragging on for months. It was exhausting, mentally, emotionally, even physically. The last thing I needed was to waste energy arguing with some power-hungry HOA president, so I ignored the fines. That was my second mistake, because Karen wasn't the kind of person you ignored. One night, I came home late from work, past midnight, and found a tow truck idling in my driveway. A man in a reflective vest stood beside it, clipboard in hand, about to hook up my car. I stepped out of my own vehicle, jaw clenched. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded. The tow truck driver jumped, then glanced at his clipboard. HOA violation. Says this vehicle is unregistered and abandoned." I stared at him. "My car? The one I just drove up in?" He scratched his head, looking nervous. "I don't know, man. I just go where I'm sent." I took a slow breath, reining in my temper. "Who sent you?" HOA President Karen Hamilton." I pulled out my phone and called Karen right then and there. She picked up after 2 rings. "Mr. Walker," she greeted, her voice oozing fake sweetness. "How can I help you?" "You can start by calling off your tow truck before I charge you with attempted vehicle theft," I said flatly. A brief pause, then a smug chuckle. "Oh dear, that won't be necessary. I was simply enforcing the community standards. We have strict rules about unregistered vehicles." "My car is registered," I shot back. "Well," she sighed, "I was under the impression you hadn't been home in weeks, so naturally I assumed it had been abandoned." I closed my eyes for a moment, counting to 5. "Karen, you have no authority to tow vehicles based on assumptions. You've been sending me baseless fines for months. This stops now." There was a long silence. Then, In a voice so soft it almost sounded mocking, she said, "I don't think you understand how this works, Mr. Walker." I felt my jaw tighten. "Oh, this is my community," she continued, her voice silky smooth, "and in my community, I make the rules. You can fight me all you want, but trust me, you won't win." And with that, she hung up. I stood there, staring at the phone in my hand, my blood running cold. Karen had just declared war, and she didn't even know who she was fighting. I wanted to deal with Karen right then and there. But duty called. My criminal case, the one that had been consuming my time for months, was entering its final phase. The trial was moving out of state for 2 months, and as lead judge, I had no choice but to go. Before I left, I made sure my house was in order. I had surveillance cameras around the property, my mail was forwarded, and I had trusted neighbors keeping an eye on things. But I still couldn't shake the unease. Karen had gone from fines to threats in a matter of weeks. She had tried to have my car towed under false pretenses. What would she do when I wasn't there to stop her? I told myself she wouldn't dare go further. After all, even Karen wouldn't be that reckless. That was my third and final mistake, because when I came back 2 months later, I pulled into my driveway and saw nothing. Not my house, not my porch, not even the foundation, just a pile of rubble. It took a full 10 seconds for my brain to process what I was seeing. Karen had demolished my house. I stepped out of my car in a daze, the heat of the sun beating down on me as I stared at the wreckage. And then, as if on cue, Karen appeared, wearing her signature smug expression, latte in hand, standing beside a brand new HOA sign that read, "Future Site of the Community Garden, sponsored by the HOA. She turned, saw me, and smiled. "Ah," she said brightly, "Mr. Walker, you're finally back." She had no idea what was coming next, because I wasn't just some homeowner. I was Judge Nathaniel Walker, and Karen Hamilton had just committed the biggest legal mistake of her life. Karen smiled at me like this was some casual neighborhood interaction, as if I hadn't just come home to find my house reduced to rubble. She adjusted her expensive blazer, her manicured fingers wrapped around a steaming latte, looking utterly unbothered. "Mr. Walker," she greeted, her tone dripping with fake warmth, "it's good to see you home again." I didn't move, didn't speak. I just stared at the pile of debris that used to be my house, trying to contain the inferno rising inside me. Karen followed my gaze, then let out an exaggerated sigh, placing a hand on her hip. "Oh, don't look so shocked," she said, as if I was the one being dramatic. "It was for the good of the community." I slowly turned to face her. "Explain," I said, my voice low and dangerous. Karen beamed, as if she was excited to show off her masterpiece. "Well, as you know," she began, gesturing toward the wreckage, "your house was outdated. It didn't align with the HOA's new modern aesthetic guidelines. And with you being gone for so long, it became an eyesore, a real detriment to the neighborhood's property values." I clenched my fists. She continued, completely oblivious to the noose tightening around her neck. "So the HOA board took a unanimous vote to repurpose the land for a community garden and welcome center. Isn't that wonderful?" Her smug grin widened, waiting for me to acknowledge her so-called brilliance. Instead, I took a slow breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "And my belongings?" I asked, keeping my expression calm, though my blood was boiling. Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, we had everything removed, of course. Some of it was donated to charity. The rest was disposed of. But honestly," she added with a condescending chuckle, "you should be thanking me. Your land is actually useful now." I stared at her. She had no idea what she had done, no idea who I was, and that was about to change. "You demolished my house," I repeated, keeping my voice low and even. Karen scoffed. "It wasn't your house anymore, Mr. Walker. It was a community improvement project. You weren't even here to maintain it." She was so confident, so sure that I was just another homeowner she could bully into submission. But when I didn't react the way she expected, when I didn't yell, argue, or threaten, I saw something shift in her expression. For the first time, uncertainty crept in. I let the silence stretch, let the weight of her mistake settle in before I finally spoke. "Karen," I said, taking a step closer, my voice cold as ice, "did you even bother to check the property ownership records before you pulled this stunt?" She blinked, taken aback by my tone. Excuse me? Did you check the legal protections on my land? I continued, my words slow and deliberate. Did you bother to look into the deed, the zoning restrictions, or the historic preservation orders? Karen's smugness wavered. She started, then stopped, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't check. She thought she could just make up the rules. I let out a quiet chuckle, shaking my head. You really have no idea what you've done, do you? I murmured. Karen's jaw tightened. Mr. Walker, I don't know what you're trying to... I pulled out my phone and with a few taps opened my contacts list. Who are you calling? She asked, a nervous edge creeping into her voice. I met her gaze, letting my next words hit her like a freight train. The sheriff, I said, to report a case of criminal trespassing, property destruction, and real estate fraud. Karen paled, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes. 15 minutes later, a black and white patrol car pulled up and Sheriff Dawson stepped out. A stocky man in his late 50s with a weathered face and a no-nonsense attitude, Dawson had been in law enforcement longer than Karen had been playing her HOA dictatorship game. He took one look at the ruins of my house, then turned to me with a grim expression. Sheriff Dawson's question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Karen's face had gone from flushed red to ghostly pale. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out, just a weak, strangled breath as she realized the noose was tightening around her. I didn't answer immediately. I just looked around. The crowd of neighbors that had gathered, many of them the same people who had blindly followed Karen's every order, were now staring at the empty lot where my house used to be. The remains of the demolition were still smoldering, dust rising in the dimming evening light. A home, my home, gone. Someone whispered, "Oh my God!" An older woman, one of the HOA's usual cheerleaders, clutched her chest. "Karen," she said, shaking her head, her voice filled with genuine horror. You really did this? You destroyed his home?" Karen spun toward her, her eyes wild, desperate. "I was enforcing the rules," she snapped. "I had the authority—" Dawson cut her off. "No, you didn't." His voice was sharp, lethal. Karen turned back to him, panic flickering in her expression. He took a step closer, his broad frame towering over her. "Karen," he said slowly, deliberately, "even if this land had been under HOA jurisdiction, which it wasn't, you still wouldn't have had the legal right to tear down someone's home." Karen's breath hitched. "That's not true," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "The community board agreed that Walker's house didn't meet neighborhood standards. It was an eyesore." "An eyesore," I repeated, my voice calm but ice cold. She whirled back to me. You refused to comply with the HOA!" I let out a humorless laugh. "So you demolished my house over a property dispute?" The crowd let out a collective gasp. Dawson ran a hand down his face, exhaling hard. "Jesus Christ, Karen!" One of the other neighbors, a man who had always kept to himself, stepped forward hesitantly. His face was ashen. He cleared his throat. I saw the trucks come in this morning. I thought it was just some routine construction. His voice broke. "I didn't know they were actually tearing it down." Others murmured in agreement. Another woman, her voice shaking, said, "We thought you had permission, Karen. We trusted you." Karen whipped around, glaring at them. "You all supported me before. Don't act like you're innocent in this." "No," someone else muttered, shaking their head. "We thought you were following the law, not committing crimes." Karen staggered back as if the words had physically struck her. Dawson wasn't finished. "This isn't just an HOA overstep, Karen," he said. His tone was deadly serious now. "This is criminal destruction of private property. You had no legal claim. None." Karen's legs wobbled. "Well, what are you saying?" she asked, her voice small now. Dawson exhaled sharply. "I'm saying you're looking at serious charges." He glanced at me again. "Walker, you pressing charges?" I smiled. "Every single one." Karen froze. Her smug facade cracked like thin ice under the weight of reality. She had bulldozed houses before, fined people into submission, ruled this neighborhood like a dictator, but she had never faced real consequences, not until now. I watched as Sheriff Dawson pulled out his radio, his voice calm but firm. "Dispatch, I need a unit at Oak Ridge Drive." We have a suspect in violation of real estate fraud, property destruction, and unauthorized land seizure. Stand by for further charges." Karen wasn't done yet. Even with her wrists in cuffs, even as Sheriff Dawson was hauling her toward the patrol car, she still thought she could escape this. "Wait! Wait!" she screeched, twisting violently in Dawson's grip. "You can't do this to me! I have rights!" "Yeah?" Dawson grunted, barely flinching as he held her firm. "So did Walker when you stole his land and bulldozed his damn house." "No!" Karen screamed. "I'm calling my husband!" Dawson sighed in annoyance, but didn't stop her as she fumbled for her phone with her cuffed hands. She hit the speed dial with her knuckle, bringing the phone to her ear. "Bill!" she sobbed. "Come right now! They're arresting me! You have to—" She froze, listening, her expression shifting from rage to desperation. I could barely hear the deep, gravelly voice on the other end. Then, Karen's face twisted into something else entirely. Satisfaction. "You're dead, Walker!" she spat suddenly, her eyes blazing with pure hatred. Sheriff Dawson immediately stiffened, his eyes narrowing. Then in the distance, tires screeched. I turned toward the sound, my pulse quickening. A black SUV came barreling down the street, kicking up dust, heading straight for us. Karen smirked. Her husband was coming, and from the way he was driving, I could tell he wasn't coming to talk. The SUV skidded to a stop just feet away from the patrol car. The driver's door flew open and out stormed Bill Hamilton. Stocky, red-faced, and brimming with anger, Bill looked like a man on the edge, but he wasn't holding a gun. He was holding pure, unfiltered rage. "You can't do this!" he bellowed, his voice booming across the quiet street. Dawson held up a hand, stepping between me and the furious man. "Bill, I need you to calm down," the sheriff said, his voice calm but firm. Bill's eyes flicked to Karen, who was twisting in her cuffs in the back seat of the patrol car. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. "They're trying to ruin us!" Karen screeched. "They're taking everything! Do something!" Bill locked eyes with me, his face contorting into a mask of rage. "This is your fault, Walker," he spat, taking a step toward me. Dawson raised a hand. "That's far enough," the sheriff warned. "You're already involved in some serious legal trouble. Don't make it worse." Bill ignored him. Instead, he charged. It happened too fast to stop. 1 second, Bill was gritting his teeth, fists clenching. The next, he lunged at Dawson. His fist swung hard, aiming straight for the sheriff's jaw. Crack! A solid hit. Dawson stumbled back, his hat flying off, a cut splitting open on his lip. Karen cheered from the back seat. "Yes, Bill! Knock him out!" Bill took another swing, but this time Dawson was ready. The sheriff sidestepped, grabbed Bill's arm mid-swing, and slam! With a quick, practiced move, Dawson twisted Bill's arm behind his back and slammed him against the hood of the SUV. Bill let out a pained grunt, but the sheriff didn't let up. "You just made the dumbest mistake of your life," Dawson muttered as he snapped handcuffs onto Bill's wrists. Bill thrashed, his face turning red, but there was no escape. "Let me go!" he roared. Dawson let out a tired sigh. "Bill Hamilton, you're under arrest for assaulting an officer, obstruction of justice, and resisting arrest." Karen let out a horrified scream. "No, no, no, no! Bill!" Dawson hauled Bill up, shoving him into the back of the second patrol car just as backup officers arrived, and just like that, the Hamilton power couple was officially in handcuffs. With Bill and Karen arrested, the legal proceedings moved fast, and the deeper we dug, the worse it got for them. Turns out, Karen had been embezzling HOA funds for years, rerouting money into private accounts while forcing homeowners to pay for fraudulent violations. And Bill? He had been buying up properties that Karen had seized, flipping them for massive profits under fake shell companies. This wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president gone rogue. This was a criminal empire built on fraud, corruption, and theft. And now, it was all coming down. Karen sat in court wearing an ill-fitting beige prison jumpsuit, her once flawless hair now a tangled mess. Bill sat next to her, bruised from his arrest, looking defeated. Judge Harper flipped through the file, then looked at them with thinly veiled disgust. "Mrs. Hamilton, Mr. Hamilton," she began, her voice stern, "you both stand accused of real estate fraud, property destruction, HOA fund embezzlement, assaulting an officer, and multiple counts of corruption." Karen opened her mouth, but Harper held up a hand. "Don't. Speak." Karen clamped her mouth shut, her face twisting in frustration. Judge Harper looked down at the documents again, then shook her head. This is one of the most blatant abuses of power I have ever seen. You ran this HOA like a dictatorship, ruining lives and stealing property under the guise of community improvement. And when someone finally stood up to you, she looked at Bill, her expression icy. You resorted to violence. Asterisk. Bill gritted his teeth, but he said nothing. Karen, however, snapped. This isn't fair, she shouted, her voice shrill and cracking. We were trying to help the neighborhood. Walker, he manipulated the system. This is all a misunderstanding. Judge Harper didn't even blink. Mrs. Hamilton, you personally signed the demolition order for a property that you did not legally own, she said flatly. You misused funds, bribed officials, and attempted to strong-arm an entire community into your personal fiefdom. Karen shook her head violently, her cuffs rattling. Please, Your Honor, Judge Harper slammed her gavel down once, silencing her. I have no sympathy for you. She turned to the bailiff. Mrs. Hamilton is sentenced to 8 years in state prison for her crimes. Karen let out a gasping sob, her whole body shaking. Judge Harper turned to Bill. And Mr. Hamilton, for assaulting an officer, resisting arrest, and aiding in fraudulent transactions? Bill closed his eyes as if bracing for the inevitable. 10 years? Karen screamed. No! The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the bailiffs moved in, grabbing the Hamiltons by their arms. Karen thrashed. Wait, please, Walker, say something! I watched as they dragged her away, her cries growing distant as she disappeared into the depths of the legal system she once thought she controlled. I didn't say a word, because justice had already spoken for me. With Karen and Bill gone, the HOA was disbanded, and all its fraudulent rules were stripped away. The homeowners who had been bullied for years were finally free. And me? I rebuilt my house, stronger and better than before. Standing on my new porch, watching the sunset over my land, I let out a slow breath. Karen and Bill had tried to erase me, but in the end, they were the ones who disappeared. And justice was finally served. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to comment Karen if you think she went way too far. Like this if you think justice was served. Share this story with someone who has ever dealt with an HOA nightmare. Your support means a lot. Let me know in the comments what you think about this crazy situation. I'd love to hear your thoughts.